Hi everyone, my name's Lisa. I'm a garden educator. Today, I'm going to show you how to become a soil scientist. Yes, that's right. If you're looking for something to do that's science related at home, I'm going to show you how to take 3 different soil tests to determine what kind of soil you have and if it's a good time to start planting. So here's another cool idea. I'm going to show you how to do 3 DIY soil tests today. Before I get started, I do want to remind you that it'd be great if you like what I'm doing to go ahead and like this video. Be sure to subscribe to my YouTube channel and also check out my Facebook page, Instagram, and all those other platforms. And follow me while I make my garden. Now let's get started. These soil tests are simple to do, and you probably have everything you need right at home. You just need a few things. You'll need soil, a few cups, some water, a shallow tub or basin or bucket, a trowel or a small shovel to dig the soil, and a glass jar with a lid. I'm going to use a mason jar. I'll show you what I have. I have this cool little bucket. It's a shallow bucket. I have my hori-hori knife. I'm going to take my soil sample with that. I have a little watering can I'm going to use, and then the best thing I found to do this first test is a mason jar with a lid. All right, let's get started. We're going to go out and first take our soil sample. Now, you can take a soil sample anywhere you want to know what kind of soil you have. And the reason we want to know about what kind of soil we have is to figure out what kind of water, how to amend it, and what kind of plants might like to live there. So I'm going to take a sample right here in this bed right next to me. It's where I'm going to be growing my cucumbers. I'm curious to find out if it's A, the right moisture, and B, what kind of soil I have. Now, when we talk about kinds of soil, we're talking about not the living part of the soil and not the air and water in the soil, but really the inorganic material in the soil. Those are the things that aren't living. And we usually call them sand, silt, or clay. Now, I love to study soil, but I get a little nervous when things get too sciencey. So I was so excited to learn that soil scientists classify soils according to particle size. Just the size of the particles and how the particles are shaped. So it's good to know what kind of soil you have because that'll tell you how water reacts to the soil and all kinds of other things. So, soil scientists classify soils according to particle size. So easy. Just the size of the particles tells us what kind of soil it is. And we've got 3 choices, basically, of the small particles in your soil: sand, silt, and clay. Sand is the biggest particle, clay is the tiniest. Now, these particles are small, but the difference in size is really huge. Do you get that? The particles are tiny, but the difference in size between sand particles and clay particles is huge. So I've got some props here to show you. If sand was this basket, about 18 inches across, silt would be this basket, about 11 inches across. And clay would be this dime. I don't even know, about 3/4 of an inch across, maybe an inch across. Very small and very flat. And that's the particle shape and size of clay. Silt is a medium-sized particle, and it's oddly shaped. It's got concave and convex shapes. It holds lots of air and water. Sand is huge. It's like a tiny little boulder. It's smooth. And when sand particles come together, they're very loose. Like one of those ballrooms that you find at entertainment centers. Sand particles, they don't fit together very, very tightly. So sandy soils are very loose and promote lots of drainage. But they don't have very many nutrients for the plants. Silty soils, they tend to hold onto water, but because they're all different shapes, When silty soils dry out, they're still loose and easy to dig. Which leaves me to the dime, the wafer. Clay soils are tiny. And when clay soils all line up together, they hold water for a long time and they become very elastic. We use clay to make pottery and cups and all kinds of things. Now, we're never going to have just one of any of these. We're going to have a mix or a loam. But it's good to know how much sand, silt, and clay and organic matter that you have in your soil. So what we're going to do is we're going to go collect a soil sample and we'll do the first test. We call this a sediment test or the shake test. I'm here in the bed that I'm going to grow all of my squash family plants, and I want to see what kind of texture this soil is. So I've got my hori knife, and what I want to do is try to take a sample that is about 6 to 8 inches down deep. I don't want to just scoop off the top. So I am going to find a place where you can see me in the camera, and I'm going to slice straight down and kind of around, and I'm going to pull out that whole sample, and I'll put that in my bucket. Now, maybe the best way to take a sample would be to go all along this bed, so I'm going to take a little bit more just from down here and see what that's like. Again, I'm going to get a nice deep piece, a little wedge that goes in. All right, I think I've got it. I've got a couple cups of soil here. This should be enough to do all 3 of my soil tests. Let's go back to the bench and see what we can find out. One way I can see what the distribution of sand, silt, and clay is in my soil is to do the shake test. So I have my soil sample, and there were a few worms in there, so I put them back in the garden. And I want about a cup of soil. This container is 2 cups, so about half. I'm going to take my mason jar and my soil, put the soil in here, and then I fill it full of water, and the shaking will begin. Fill your jar all the way. There we go. Now, this is critical. Make sure the lid's on nice and tight. And when you start shaking, hold the top. Shake it, shake it, shake it, and then let it settle. Shake it, shake it, shake it. The first things that you see that start to fall are sand particles. The next layer, and it may take a while, will be the silt particles. And finally, all of this murkiness is mostly clay, tiny little particles, little wafers that are just floating in the air. They're going to take a while to finally settle. I'll be checking back on this as we go to see how close we are to getting this settled. It may take several days for this water to become clear, but it will. My shake test has been sitting for maybe 10 minutes, and I can really start to see the sand and the silt. Now, all this murky water, that is clay suspended in the water. And at the very top, you can see some floaties, and those are the organic matter. So this is kind of a sketch I made of what I see so far. A big layer of sand at the bottom, a pretty thick layer of dark silt, all the murkiness of clay, and all these particles at the top, the organic matter that's still floating. Now, as I said, the clay may take a little while before it settles, and I'll keep checking it over the next hour or so to see where we are. As I said, some soils I've tested take days before the water becomes clear. Why don't you try this at home and take a record of it over the course of a day or so and see how close your soil comes to having clear water. It has been about 2 hours. And you can see the water's still very murky. But you can see the floaties still on the top. But the murkiness is kind of clearing a little bit, but then you can really see that nice layer of silt. I'll watch it a few days, and I'll post later how long it took for the water to become clear, and I'll show some pictures. The other sediment test, or the other texture test that we can take is called the ribbon test. And this is one actually where we get to use our hands. And we're going to take that same soil sample and see if we can get it to stick together. Okay, it's a little bit dry for this test, so I'm going to use just a little water. And to control my water, I'm going to put it in a little container. I don't have very much water here. If I add a lot of water and make it soggy, it interferes with the results. So I just want it wet enough to hold together. And I think I got it. It's nice and crumbly. It's starting to hold together, but it's not dripping when I squeeze it. It does feel nice and sticky. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this handful and I'm going to try to squeeze it through my hands and form a worm or a ribbon that is about an inch long, or an inch wide, and as long as I can possibly make it. Now look, there it's kind of sticking together, but that's about where it breaks. So my soil holds together. It's not sand. If it was sandy, it would never hold together. And I can make about an inch or an inch and a half ribbon before it starts to break, which tells me it's not super clay, but it does have some stickiness to it. So I know from working in this soil that I have a lot of silt. So it holds water in the winter. It stays very wet all spring long, but it requires a lot less water throughout the season. And look, I can make this into there's my worm, and there's where it breaks. This is super fun. Once you get your soil all wet like this, you could make little figurines or little mud pies, or have fun with it. Put it back in the garden. If you want it to go back in the garden, I would let it dry out a little bit before I put it back in the garden. But I like taking this wet soil after I've done my soil tests, and I like to make structures and little ponds, little places that hold water, maybe a little fort for a sow bug. So be creative. You could also put leaves or flowers on this. So, you know, the wet soil doesn't have to go to waste. You can actually do some fun stuff with it, or you can just dig it back into the garden. So, looks like my soil is sticky enough to hold together, but not enough to make a long worm. If I could make a worm 2 inches long or longer, then I've got a lot of clay in my soil. But I had about 1 inch to 1.5 inches before my soil broke apart. I'm glad it held together, because although sandy soil is easy to dig, it drains so much, it's hard to keep it watered, and really those big particles of sand don't have a lot of nutrients to offer my plants. So that's soil test number 2, and it's called the ribbon test. Try it at home. Especially in early spring, people always ask me, when's a good time? When can they start to dig? Is there a way they can tell when the soil is perfect? And I always tell them to take a moisture test. It's important to dig the soil when the moisture's perfect. If you dig in your soil and it's too wet, the soil will break up into clods like this. And even after the soil has dried, it will remain clods. So you want to test the soil. If it's too wet, you're going to wreck all the structure you've been working so hard to build. If you try to plant and the soil's too dry, your holes will just collapse, and that will make it difficult to plant properly. So you want to make sure your soil is just right. And this is a pretty easy test. It's one that I take every time I work with the soil. If I'm getting some potting soil ready, if I'm working with containers, if I'm working in a raised bed or right in the garden, I always take a soil test to make sure the soil is just right. So here, I've got the sample that we took. I'm going to take a handful of the sample, and I could be just in my garden bed and take a handful of the soil. And I'm going to squeeze it gently until it forms a ball. If it doesn't form a ball, too dry. Now, I want to make sure it's not too wet. So it's wet enough to hold together in a ball when I loosely squeeze it. Let me see if it's too wet to dig. I'm going to throw it up in the air about 8 or 10 inches above my hand and let it come back on my hand and see if it breaks apart. If it breaks apart easily, the soil's perfect. Perfect! The soil broke apart easily, so I am ready to dig. And that's your soil moisture test. You try it all over your garden or a container or just some soil that you dig up from somewhere. See if you get it just right. Well, that was fun. We just did 3 fun, easy DIY soil tests that you can do in your backyard or just get soil from somewhere, anywhere, and test it. You can do the shake test to see the distribution, the amount of sand, silt, and clay your soil and organic matter that your soil contains. You can do the ribbon test, get it wet and see how sticky it is and how long a worm or ribbon you can make. See how much clay is there. And finally, before you dig, before you plant, whether it's in the ground or in a container, make sure your soil's the right moisture. So do that simple moisture test where you grab the soil, throw it up, let it come down and see if it breaks apart. If you find that your soil's too dry, you can always run a sprinkler or water it and let it sit for a couple of hours and check it again. Trust me, it's better to plant when your soil's the right moisture than to struggle with a dust bowl. Well, my name's Lisa. I'm a garden educator. Thanks for watching my show. Thanks for supporting me through this. Be sure to like this video if you did like it, and subscribe to my channel. And try this experiment at home and let me know how it goes. Leave me a little comment somewhere.